Hollywood has a habit of beating the life out of every successful IP or just franchise that they've ever had. And more often than not, it ends up in disappointment over and over and over again. So when I heard that Gladiator, one of my all-time favourite films, directed by Ridley Scott, was getting a legacy sequel, I was extremely nervous, as I was certain Hollywood were going to set out to ruin another one of my favourite franchises. Nevertheless, I went into the cinema a few days later after its release and saw that despite the first film being released 24 years ago, the cinema was still almost full, showing that the film still had a large audience even all this time later, which just goes to show the quality that the original had. And despite my hesitation initially, I ended up really enjoying the movie. In fact, it is one of the best legacy sequels that I've ever seen. It's got to be up there with the likes of Top Gun Maverick and Blade Runner 2049. What I really appreciated was how familiar the whole world felt of the movie. Most legacy sequels take place in the same or very similar locations to the last, but because both films had the same director, the framing, pacing and visuals within the story all felt like they could have come straight from the original film and I wouldn't have noticed. And I like that, because there are many times where where big franchises have different directors in each movie and you can visibly tell the difference, and it becomes jarring and grating when you view it as one continuous storyline. But when the director's the same, or when the director tries to capture the essence of the first films, that's when it works the best. So I went to the cinema with a friend and he hadn't seen the original Gladiator film. And I was worried he wouldn't enjoy it as much because there would be maybe too much overlap in the story from the first one and it wouldn't make sense. But this movie's plot is perfectly balanced. The story is extremely original and works perfectly as a standalone film, but also has enough connection to the original film to satisfy the OG fans. There's enough references and callbacks to previous characters that the OG fans could understand, but if you haven't seen those films, you can infer from context who they are and why it's significant in some way. It's very difficult for a legacy sequel to meet the expectations set by its predecessor, because the original films also benefit from not only, as I said, being a very unique concept, films like Gladiator and also films like Blade Runner 2049 and Top Gun Maverick were also very original. And they also benefit from nostalgia, because it came out so long ago. A lot of the fans were younger, and you always tend to have a connection to the things that you watched and consumed when you were younger, which causes all the fans to look back on the film with the rose-tinted glasses, and maybe they don't remember the issues the first film had, although there weren't very many, and it tends for them to sort of be hypercritical of future films because of the passion they had for the first one, because of the time of their life they were when they experienced it. Now, obviously the first film was carried by an amazing performance from Russell Crowe, but I think this movie has some great performances. In fact, I think pretty much every performance in this movie is very good. Paul Mescal had some big boots to fill, as Russell Crowe gave one of the all-time best performances and a career best for him. And whilst I have to admit I don't think he quite met the expectations because they were so monolithic, he definitely puts in a great performance that can go down as one of his all-time best. He was very stoic, but was always passionate when he needed to be. He was just the right amount of emotional and strong, and his demeanour and his voice fit perfectly with the time period that the film was set in. Pedro Pascal also had a great performance, but maybe, much like most heterosexual men, I'm biased due to my unimaginable and worryingly homosexual crush on him. But the best performer was shock horror Denzel. Definitely Denzel Washington. I always feel like Denzel Washington gets an easy route in Hollywood. I just feel like a lot of his characters seem to be the same. They're always aggressive, morally ambiguous men who ultimately mean well. And then I see performances like this from him in things like Training Day and, of course, this movie. And that's when I'm reminded of why he's commonly referred to as one of the best actors working today, which is a sentiment I can agree with. I think he's so well suited to a role like this. He's a very sophisticated actor, and he plays a very sophisticated and cunning character, and is there anyone better than Denzel Washington at playing a sort of tentative, plays a villain who's holding a storm within, quite like Denzel Washington? I don't think anyone can have that sort of conflict internally, with that calm demeanour, with the fiery inside. I don't think anyone can play that role better than Denzel. And I think that was a perfect casting and a perfect performance, really. The film wasn't perfect, though. I did have some issues with it. One of the issues I did have was I think the pacing was not the best, and definitely not as good as it was in the first film. Especially in the first act. I think the first act did really drag. But I think as it went on, I think it became a lot better. I think the third act was paced pretty well. I just think the first act was, I don't want to say it was a pain to get through, but it was quite a slog for the first maybe half an hour to 45 minutes. The opening battle scene's very good, but then I think there's just a lot of unnecessary scenes that I feel like could have been cut from the film, which is weird because I feel like there was also, they could have spent more time on Harrow developing his character, but the time they did spend just didn't seem to be used as well. I think they could have used that time better. But I think the pacing did get better throughout the second and third acts, the third act specifically. Also, the thing about the monkey being elected as a consul, you know, it was funny, but it felt very out of place with how serious this movie is. I mean, I know, like, syphilis was rife at that time and throughout history, so I understand that was very possible, but just, like, having a syphilitic emperor elect a monkey is just, like, I understand you want to show that the Rome's in a poor state, you know, and maybe Denzel Washington's character is justified in his actions because he sees the dark path that Rome's going on, but I think that was just a bit of a silly way to get to that point, to be honest. Now, one thing I did notice about this movie that may have been an improvement on the first one was how great the action was. You know, I know the first film was made years ago and CGI and special effects have come a long way since then, and of course the CGI and special effects in this film are better, but also the practical effects were so good. I think that, you know, the way that they made, like, all these injuries look super realistic was great. But I think one thing that was really good was how well choreographed the actions were. You know, they weren't excessively, you know, CGI'd or, you know, scripted. The fights seemed like real fights, you know, and that shows how good the choreography was. I know it's nitpicky, but it's always bothered me that there is, you know, in modern action films, how unrealistic fight scenes are. Not only is the combat so illogical, as characters take near fatal blows with every strike, yet seem to be completely unharmed afterwards and just carry on with the rest of the hour of the movie, but the editing was just always so jarring. You know, the camera would always be too close, and there would always be so many different angles, and the constant cuts between the scene. You know, it just really hurts my head at points, honestly. It makes me dizzy. But luckily, all the action scenes in this film seem to have, you know, minimal cuts, and, you know, they have well choreographed shots, you know, that tend to go on for a few sequences to make it seem like more comprehensible. Another thing I like about the battle scenes is there was always a lot going on, which is appropriate for something like war, but you could still sort of tell what was going on. That was just a little thing I picked up on. I just like how in these scenes where you're supposed to be focusing on one thing, everything in the background is also just as interesting as what's happening in the foreground, even though obviously what's happening in the foreground is the main focus, you know. I just liked how they, you know, the battle scenes really worked like that. All in all, I really like this movie. I think it had some Oscar-worthy performances, specifically from Denzel, and it had some great cinematography. I mean, really good at points. I also appreciate how long of a gap there was between the first and second films. I like when studios don't rush into sequel on top of sequel, and they just sort of let the work speak for itself. You know, instead of rushing into that, you know, they instead chose to take their time, ensuring they have a story worth telling, and really working it through to a conclusion that was, you know, satisfactory. And they made sure, and, you know, waiting this time made sure that the end product was high enough quality that it could stand alongside its predecessor in such a beloved franchise. And in a world where the audience has no time to breathe between Marvel, Star Wars and other Disney releases, it's nice to have some IPs and some studios that maybe on the surface seems to at least have some creative integrity left. Well, until of course Disney buys everyone out and creates a virtual cinematic monopoly. And then we'll all be fucked.